Hello, everybody, and welcome. I won't be long this time. As you all know, Edmund de Waal is here this evening to talk about his love for Proust with Tonkin, who is the soul of the French Passion series. It's an event we've been looking forward to very, very, very much. I just want to say that due to unfortunate circumstances, Edmund has to leave at 8 and won't be able to sign any books after the talk. But it is incredibly generous of him to have maintained the talk under these circumstances. And I really want you to welcome him as wholeheartedly as I do. Thank you, Edmund, for being here.
Thank you, Hélène, and thank you to Edmund for coming. It really is a thrill and delight to welcome you this evening for this fourth edition of the French Passions series. And of course, in a way, no French writer has ever inspired quite as much quiet passion on both sides of the Manche as Proust. I'm particularly excited because there are so many creative connections between the work we'll be discussing and Edmund's own work. Now, it's probably slightly superfluous for me to introduce him, but of course he is now known to a huge readership in Britain as the author of what one reviewer called the perfect book. The perfect book, of course, is the Hare with Amber Eyes, the extraordinary memoir, although memoir is maybe slightly a limiting word, of his family, refracted through the collection of 264 Netsuki that he inherited. But of course, before the book, which it's amazing to consider only came out last year, Edmund was, to many people, what you might call the perfect potter as well. Famously trained with Bernard Leach, the great importer into British ceramics of the classical Japanese tradition, or at least of his version of the classical Japanese tradition, which is maybe something that we can talk about later. Edmund was a disciple, if we can use that word, certainly someone very much following in the wake of Leach. But then, as all the best disciples do, he rebelled and created his own style, a style which led to great acclaim, to widespread recognition around the world, and to a series of landmark exhibitions from the mid-1990s onwards. And then, as if that wasn't enough for one career, the book came out last year, and I don't think it's unfair to say that it was a book for which its publishers would have had, they might have been quietly confident, but at the same time, the expectations might have been, in the commercial hurly-burly of the publishing world at the moment, relatively on the modest side. To say that it exceeded them would be a gross understatement. And we're not simply talking about the number of volumes sold, but the depth of affection and recognition that the book has triggered in many people, which has been really on a quite remarkable level. It's clearly a book about a family, and a family living through periods that stretch from the elegance of the Belle Epoque to the atrocious barbarism of the age of genocide and its aftermath. It's a book that takes us through a variety of cities and their distinctive cultures, from Odessa, the family home of the Aphrosis, through Paris, Vienna, and of course finally to Tokyo. And it's also a book supremely about memory and art, and how memory and art intersect in all sorts of unexpected and productive ways. So with that spectrum of themes behind it, I won't say that there could be no other writer to talk about than Proust, but Proust is clearly has a special affinity with so many of the subjects that have surfaced in Edmund's career. And I wanted to ask, first of all, about your first encounter with Proust and his work, and also what your first reaction was on reading Proust.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Boyd. And it's a huge privilege to be here, and also terribly scary, I have to say. There can be few experiences more scary than talking about Proust in public. And I can't see you because the lights are in my eyes. So I imagine ranks of Proustians going back into the foothills of the Institut Français. My very first experience of Proust was with my grandmother, appropriately enough. And you have to begin, if you begin with Proust with your grandmother, Proust begins with his grandmother, so it's all rather wonderful. But she lived in Tunbridge Wells, a great place to be exiled to, and in her study was her collection of Proust. And I remember being a teenager, very gauche teenager, and going, I used to go and see her a lot. She was, amongst other things, a poet. And I would take my very jeune scribblings, and she would completely unforgivingly critique them, which is quite good in a grandmother, I think. And she would say, "And have you read Proust yet?" And I would say, "Well, no." And she said, "You will." And then I actually read Proust for the very first time when I was studying English at Cambridge, and there's a French paper. We were talking about this just a minute ago, and you have to do a French paper, and that was my first experience. As you did, Boyd, the very first exercise you do with a French paper is they give you
the first passage, the first page to translate.
To translate, which of course is complete madness. And that was my very first experience. And I remember writing to my grandmother saying, "What do I do? I've been given Proust to translate." And she wrote back and said, "Well, get on with it." And that was my very first introduction. And it was extraordinary. I remember being completely captivated. I have to say straight out that I read French very badly, and that I've been reading Proust badly in French, but passionately in English. And then I've just been reading and rereading Proust for the last 30 years.
Something that I've asked previous participants in the series is, as it were, how has their beloved writer changed over time? Is the Proust that you read now a different sort of author to the one that you first discovered at Cambridge? And if so, in what ways?
That's a really fascinating question. And living with Proust, yes, absolutely. I mean, I find it hard to think of a more Protean writer, someone who takes you back repeatedly and in whom I encounter different things on all kinds of levels. So I can remember my very first readings of Proust, the sort of just the kind of delight in the sort of immersiveness of the prose and the breathlessness of the sentences, that wonderful, extraordinary sense of never being able to finish, which is sort of characteristic, and finding that so exciting. But then, obviously, through the years, I've come back in different ways, and in fact, this whole journey into memoir, and I love the word memoir. You can use that word with huge anytime you want around my family book. I lived with Proust through the writing, the 10 years of journeying and thinking and writing and researching that.
And it's an invidious question, but with a book, a novel that is so voluminous, that is so multifaceted, do you have favorites? Favorite volumes, favorite characters, favorite incidents?
Of course. And they change constantly. So where are we? We're on a Thursday night, aren't we? So what would it be on Thursday night under these lights? I mean, for me, one of the most haunting things in the book, one of my favourite people in the book is Swan, and on all kinds of levels, but on a very basic level, Boyd, because part of my attempt to write this family story was an attempt to understand how you can animate places, rooms, detail, furniture through the prism of memory. So how could I not be profoundly thinking the whole time about Proust? And along the way, I discovered this extraordinary and beautiful and troubling correspondence between Charles Swann and the man who collected this great collection of Netscape, Charles Zeffrussi, and this extraordinarily moving kind of mapping that I found between Swann and this great uncle of mine was so much part of the journey that I do feel that Swann for me is I have a very deep affection.
And how far was it? I mean, to say that one's ancestor is sort of connected to Charles Swann is rather like saying that sort of my great-grandfather was King Lear. I mean, there is to have such a dominating figure in world literature in one's background. Did the sheer radiance of that connection somehow make it harder to see your real ancestor?
I was terribly anxious about this because I fell in love completely with this wonderful man, Charles Zeffrussi, who collected this. Belle Epoque, Jewish, a great lover of women, a great lover of women, but also with great affection for men, and possibly that too, and a great collector, but of Impressionist art, of Renaissance furniture, of all the things that Swann collects. But the key thing was that the reason I fell in love with him was not only that he was a great writer about art, a great animator of the things he looked at, just like Swann writes about Vermeer, my Charles writes about Dürer beautifully. But the thing that made me fall in love with him, this is a Proustian sentence, it's going on. The thing that made me absolutely fall in love with him is that all the people he encounters love him. All the people, he has this extraordinary ability, my Charles, of bringing people to life in conversation, and bringing the best out of artists or the best out of poets or composers, and that I felt was absolutely at the heart of Swann. That's my feeling. I mean, we all have our own Charles Swanns, but my Swann is someone who everyone feels diminished when he leaves the room. That he is someone who is extraordinary and modest, but has that gift of bringing things alive. And that was my sense of my Charles. But it was difficult. Sorry, it is a set Proustian, because because there's a real danger about Proust that you can get into stamp collecting, and you can go, and I see this, and I fear it. That you there's the character list, and Chalou is this person, and Odette is this person, and the princess is and you map it all in this way, and it's dead, and it's fiction. I mean, that's the point. Proust is he writes fiction. It's not there are all these correspondences, but and so I dreaded bringing Proust down into anecdote.
And also, presumably, to be accused of having claimed that your great uncle was Swan or whatever, which you never do.
No, and in fact, I actually have to say, just the two of us, entre nous, I actually didn't write about Proust at all. I left it all out. I wrote it and then took it out. And my dear French editor rang up in great distress and said, "What have you done with the Proust?" And I was very nervous because I felt that it might just, overshadow the real story.
Now, both in your family history and also, of course, in the world of the novel that Proust describes, there is obviously this extraordinary surface elegance, glamour, cultivation, but also the sense of really dark and dangerous forces underneath. And maybe you could say a little more about that, both in your real-life ancestry and also the way that Proust hints at, as it were, the gathering storm.
Well, I mean, you begin with the fact that Proust, in this glittering edifice of Paris, this is forensically aware of what it is to be Jewish. As a writer at that time, he lives through the Dreyfus affair, and he senses and analyzes completely the minutiae of what happens to people as those doors of salons shut in the faces of Jews, society, Jewish men of the world. How people are forced to take sides, how people equivocate and lie. I mean, that's one of the most powerful episodes in the books, are those delineations of the lying that goes on, and all that is in the book. And I knew that because I'd been reading and rereading this, and it's very powerful. But then when I spend that time in the archives and in the London Library and in Paris and start reading the real texture of the Dreyfus affair and start coming across all the moments when my family, as visible Jewish people in society, get vilified, have columns written about them in the newspaper, get spat at in the street, have things thrown through their windows. They were friends also of Zola, and there was that whole other thing that went on with their family. And so it becomes incredibly, incredibly tough. This interpenetration of the novel and the real terror of living through the Dreyfus affair was very difficult for me to write about, because, of course, what I'm trying to do is to write about the real and the imagined the whole time, and he did it first.
And this takes us on, I think, quite seamlessly to one of the great illusions about Proust for people who don't read him, which is that he's simply concerned with the minutiae of high society, and it is merely, as it were, drawing these tiny little filigree illustrations about a very minute upper stratum, which has no relevance to anything else that's going on. But if one reads properly, one gets a portrait of every layer of society.
Yeah, you do. I mean, you absolutely get every layer of society. But more than that, you get an extraordinary extraordinary and profound excavation of memory and loss. I mean, it is the greatest, I have to say, for me, the greatest exploration of the limits of memory, of how memory occurs and what gets lost in memory. And the fact that happens often through descriptions of salons or parties or people cutting you on the beach, or the fact that the footman looks like a Donatello, that's one thing. But that's because surface matters. That's because detail absolutely matters. And to get the detail right is crucial for Proust. It's absolutely crucial for Proust. There's that sense of the weight of the world being incredibly strong. That's why you can inhabit the spaces that he inhabits, and that matters because those spaces keep coming back, refracted over 1.5 million words, and over lifetimes. And what could be sort of more important than how memory happens?
But once you accept that organizing principle of Proust, that there is always a disjunction between, if you like, memory and narrative, or the event and its representation, then how do you incorporate that into your own work when you're trying to resurrect not simply recollected events, but those that you have had to reanimate via the hard work of research?
Well, I mean, you're never going to get me in public saying that Proust is a good model, because that's, it would be a stupid thing to say. But there is a principle which is about immanence, and it's about the fact that within the novel, the novels that make up À la Recherche, people keep encountering real buildings, particular paintings, and invented buildings, and inventing places, and real people. And so there's this extraordinary, complicated sense of the contingency of storytelling, that there can be real things which work in particular ways, and there can be imagined things which are more powerful than that. And both of those things work on each other all the time. And that's how narrative works, that storytelling with real events and real people and real things, with the imagined. Now, so of course, when I'm trying to learn to write, which is what this book was an attempt to learn to write, about real people and real objects and their refraction into Proust, and in Vienna in Joseph Roth, and Odessa to Isaac Babel, and through letters from my grandmother to Rilke, all this extraordinary kind of wealth of other imagined recreations of real people and real times, then how can I not think about storytelling and the kind of perilousness of storytelling, which is at the heart of Proust?
Now, of course, the one trap that you or any other serious writer has to avoid in this context is the sort of glib postmodernism that says that history is a story and fiction is a story, and therefore we don't need to care about any level of authenticity or responsibility or accountability to the past. Now, obviously, your book is the opposite of that approach, while at the same time allowing that there are these epistemological problems which are always going to confront the investigator of the past. But is it hard to avoid the relativism of saying that all narratives are the same, particularly in the climate which encourages us to do so?
Well, it's just bullshit, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of, why bother with that? I mean, really, why bother with that? I mean, also, in a very real sense, there is a, you have to dare to sound, to you have to dare to say this, but there is a responsibility to storytelling. If it's about your family, you can write a novel. That's fine. It's not. It's a memoir. It's a memoir, and in that sense, relativism go hanged, because it's got to work as a story, and that's why fiction matters. But my God, if you have a story which has some kind of gravity to it, some kind of weight, some kind of tactility to it, then you have to hand that on, forgetting that all that nonsense about relativism, I think, actually.
But to move into I hope sort of slightly more sophisticated territory, the wonderful thing about Proust is that when he talks about art, or when he talks about people, it is so often not about their direct presence. It's about their refraction. It's not the painting that you see, but the painting that you think you have seen. And it's as it were, the exploration of the creative distance between the two. Again, was that a principle that guided you when you were?
That's absolutely a principle. But that's the principle for my other life. You see, that's which is that so much of my work as someone who makes things begins with remembering something, a poem, a piece of music, a little phrase, often. That's a quotation from Proust. Or like this piece I did at the V&A, a whole collection of ceramics, and then it's remembered. I remember it, and then I remake it, because that's absolutely about immanence. That principle of making something which has a starting point somewhere else, and you hope that it retains that sort of pulse of memory in some kind of way, but is completely other, has some kind of integrity, some kind of otherness, some kind of different refraction, is what I've been doing in pots for quite a long time.
So to go back to the question that I warned you I was going to ask, can there be a Proustian pot?
Yes. I mean, there can be a Proustian pot. I have to say, whenever people talk about the Madeleine and the tisane and stuff, they forget that it's dunked into a little porcelain cups. So I would like to make a big claim here for involuntary memory in porcelain. Okay, I'll get that out of the way. I've always wanted to say that. Yes, of course there can be a Proustian pot, and one of the huge pleasures about reading Proust is that Proust is profoundly interested in the somatic, in the bodily. He really is. And I hate it when people talk about Proust as sort of the abstraction of Proust. Well, no. Proust is profoundly interested in how, in the somatic responses, the bodily responses to things. And yes, a Proustian pot, and a Proustian installation of pots as well. And more to come on that. Yes, there is sorry, this is tangential, but I'm going to put it in, if I may, which is that you know that something I've always loved and found very generative of around Proust, of ideas, is his galleys, the galleys. That Proust could never finish. And he sent his publishers into paroxysms of anxiety and terror by endlessly repasting on top of the, and the wonderful, I'm sure you all know this, I can't see, but the proofs are worth looking at, because they're, there they are, handwritten over, more typescript on top of that, handwritten on that, endlessly, repeatedly, that sense of being endlessly in conversation with a voice and going back again and again into a text. Now, when I look at those proofs and just looking at the proofs, that has been so exciting for me over the years, because that's exactly how I make installations. That's exactly, I make something, a row of pots, a group of pots, and it's great. It's beautiful, it's lyrical, it's finished, and then it's not finished, and I come back, and more goes in, and some come out, and then I refire things, and then something has to be gilded, and then it comes back. And that whole thing about going back into text again and again and again is something that, for me, is there when I look at Proust's galleys.
And of course, that to some extent was challenging for readers of Proust, and still is challenging if you have essentially a classical aesthetic, which is about the product rather than the process.
Yes.
I mean, if you have, as it were, an aesthetic of flow, of sort of continuous revival and transformation, metamorphosis, that's easy to live with. But of course, to some extent, we still, whether it's in pots or novels, we don't. There's still a tendency, perhaps, to want to see things finished prematurely.
Yeah. But you see, that's about taking time, and that's why Proust is always out there, as the great challenge, because it's about taking time. And is there ever a writer who has made more demands in terms of the amount of time you take to read and reread? And that's kind of wonderful, it really is. It's because it doesn't do that thing about the perfect lyrical closure that we kind of have got used to in from the 20s onwards, in terms of it just doesn't do that. It just provokes, because you can't rush Proust.
And when I don't want to make any far-fetched connections, but when you were earlier in your career as a potter, did you sense then, or do you sense now, any affinity between this notion of what art is and, say, the Japanese inheritance that you were working with through Leech, and that approach to doing ceramics?
I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, that the thing is, my inheritance from Japan through Leech was very dogmatic, and I was a very, very, very pure disciple. It took me a long time to work through all that, and it's funny because I found recently in my quotes archive filing cabinet an article I wrote when I was about 20 and had been in Japan, and I was listening. I read it, and I was with pink cheeks, huge embarrassment, but the voice there was so dogmatic and was so it was a bit of ventriloquism for Leech, that it just showed me just how much I was forcing myself down a particular road. The journey into making different kinds of things, I take a long time with things, and weirdly I had to learn Japanese and write a book about Bernard Leech in order to make the next kind of pots, and I'm slightly convinced that this memoir was a very, very long-winded way of making the next kind of work that I want to make. So, does that make sense? I have to write books in order to make pots.
It absolutely makes sense, but it's
that wasn't your question, was it? I'm sorry.
No, but it's very interesting, because I want, when you are making pots, this goes back to, as it were, the memory of other arts. What is the impression or the recollection of a poem or a painting doing literally to guide your hand.
Yeah, it's doing a lot. So, for instance, I've just made a piece, installation which I finished. What's today? Thursday. I finished it on Wednesday, and it's a small vitrine. Okay, I now make vitrines, which is something that I learnt how to do through writing this book and looking at Proust. So I finished this piece, and it's called The Elements of Style. And it's 40 pieces of porcelain. And each of the pieces of porcelain in this cabinet has something done to it. So it's thrown in a very simple way on the potter's wheel out of porcelain, all white. And then for each of these 40 pieces of porcelain, I've done one other movement. And each of those movements I've done is something you shouldn't do as a potter. So I've dropped it, or I've hit it, or I've stamped it in a particular way, or I've cut it in a particular way. And all those gestures that I've made are non-ceramic things, which I've learnt from doing other things, like editing books, or being in archives. So it's a whole, it sounds so arcane, it's really beautiful. It's a really lovely piece. It's very simple, but it's absolutely about the memory of pots, but it's also about the memory of ordering things, which comes out of spending time in archives.
And maybe a little out of Proust as well, but because there's so many. If you think of how the narrator discusses literature, and the sense of how what is deemed to be pure and perfect writing is actually imperfect, and vice versa as well.
And I mean, and that's, goodness, I was so serious just then. But actually, do you know there's something. There's so much pleasure in Proust. I mean, what we've completely left out so far is the humour of Proust. You know, the extraordinary, fantastic joy in other people's language and other people's writing, which happens in the novels. I mean, there is that extraordinary sense of layering of other people's voices and other people's words, which is entirely, people imagine who haven't read Proust is this sort of terrifying 15,000-page homogeneous, sleepy drift. But it's so full of grit.
It's so full of as it were, perfection of various kinds being interfered with by the collision of registers in language and society and so forth, which is the origin of comedy.
Absolutely. Am I allowed to, there's just this beautiful bit about vitrines. Can I quickly read a bit on vitrines? It's just because, as soon as I brought it up. Which is just Swan. It's just Swan, and it's Swan at the end of his life. Can I? Yeah. Okay. Even when one is no longer attached to things, it's still something to have been attached to them, because it was always for reasons which other people didn't grasp. Well, now that I'm a little too weary to live with other people, these old feelings, so personal and individual, that I had in the past, they seem to me, it's the mania of all collectors, very precious. I open my heart to myself like a sort of vitrine, and examine one by one all those love affairs of which the world can know nothing. And of this collection to which I'm now much more attached than to my others, I say to myself, rather as Mazarin said of his books, but in fact without the least distress, that it will be very tiresome to have to leave it all. Which is beautiful, which is really beautiful. And it's Swan, obviously, about collecting and about love and what happens, about memory of love. But that's also, it's an extraordinary moment, surely, about Proust and language, about Proust taking out particular moments one by one and thinking of them as a vitrine and looking at them and putting them back in again.
But also not wanting to impose on them an unnatural harmony.
Yeah, yeah.
Because, as it were, the circle will never be completed.
Exactly. And so to circle back to this odd vitrine, you know, there they all are, and they only come together at the final moment when you close the door. You know, that's when the piece is finished. You know, when they're all out in the world, doing their things in the studio and being looked at. You know, they're all still in this generative state of flux and animation, but then they only truly come alive at the moment the door closes. It's very odd. It's very, very odd. It's actually very similar. It's strangely similar to that experience of actually holding a book that you finished. You know, that sense of an object suddenly having a life which you really can't comprehend.
And a life which only exists in other people's minds.
Then it goes, exactly. And then it's off. Yeah.
Do you think that we live in a time in which Proust can still acquire the readers that he needs? In other words, in which these elements of slowness and reflection and mediated recollection are valued?
Of course, and I mean, I would say that there's never been a more important time for Proust. I mean, I'm sure people have been saying this for almost 100 years. I mean, there are always readers, aren't there? I mean, you can never say this is a terrible time for books, or, you know, a Kindle will kill the book, or, you know, people are watching too much television and playing. It's not true. It's not true. People will always find books, and they will always find Proust. I mean, they will always find Proust. And there are, you know, I have to say the only thing that I think will stop people finding Proust are really, really bad costume drama films with Jeremy Irons. They are the only thing that will stop people reading Proust. I love Sebald. Two books in particular. I'm sure everyone here has read him, but a wonderful, wonderful German writer who died tragically young, a professor of comparative literature, I think, at UEA. But two books in particular, Austerlitz and The Emigrants, are books that matter to me hugely. And they matter to me because he did an extraordinary thing, which is to write about loss and to write about exile without being melancholy. I mean, he's accused of being melancholy, but I can't find melancholy in his work at all. And that seemed to me a profoundly important thing to be able to do. I mean, I write in the book that my fear is that of the taint of nostalgia, which is an invidious and dreadful disease in books. And it's not something that I would like to be accused of. But I think even more insidious is melancholia. And I think Sebald manages to avoid it. And for that reason, beyond anything, beyond even his vagabonding, his way of traveling around European cities, that tone and that voice is something that has been terribly important to me. So thank you, yes. Well, do you know what? I've just been in Paris trying to launch the edition, and I had such a cross French journalist who said to me, "You're English and you seem to be writing about Proust," and basically said, "How dare you?" And I've been dreading someone standing up and saying exactly the same thing. So here's your chance. Well, here I have got Kilmartin, I think. I mean, the first time I read was Scott Moncrief. And I have it's really embarrassing, I've got a huge affection for Scott Moncrief. I really loved it. And then I got told off by everyone who knew more. I think the things that gets accused of sort of being slightly out of focus, doesn't he? Really.
Well, he gets accused of all sorts of basic inaccuracies, and also a bit of embroidery as well.
Yeah.
But after all, I mean, for me, yes, there are imperfections, but of course, Scott Moncrief was much closer to being a character in Proust than any subsequent translator, so did have that amazing inwardness as well.
I mean, there are the new ones as well. I mean, we were talking about this just a minute ago. Now, who was the? I know Lydia Davis was one of the 7, but who was the general editor of it?
It was Christopher Prendergast.
That's right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So you're a Scott Moncrief fan? Yeah. Yeah. Good. Well, there you go. This is real fame. Okay. This is incredible. This is true fame. Yesterday I was asked by Foyles to choose 20 paperbacks, my favourite paperbacks, which they're going to have out in a window somewhere, and that Memoirs of an Anti-Semite was one of them. Okay, so and Sebald actually was another. So there you go. But that gave me so much pleasure because it is a book that obviously you're a fan, but it's a book that curiously enough hasn't got quite the readership it should have. Do you?
Yes.
Yeah, of course you do. I'm sorry.
And of course his widow runs this wonderful foundation outside Florence as well, which maybe you've been to. Have you?
Not yet. How exciting!
You should. Yes. Yeah. But you must tell me about your Waterston selection. Does Proust count as one choice, or 6 choices, or 12 choices?
It has to be one. 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 I think of it as a novel. I mean, I do think. I think of it as a novel. I'm sure there are Proustians there who I can't see, who are shaking their heads at me over their pince-nez at me now. But I think of it as a novel. Yeah. It's a huge hostage to fortune to talk about that because I simply don't have the sensitivity to it. I did read it in French with my grandmother. But I would never dream of commenting on what's lost because I simply don't know. And I am hugely jealous. I am profoundly jealous of those who can read it in one language and read it in another and pick up cadences and pick up different speeds of reading. An intonation in the reading that are simply beyond me. So my guess is from your accent that you probably can, and so there you go.
Is it something about bad adaptations of Proust, or is it the very idea of incarnating what should be essentially playing on the screen of the mind and the imagination? Could there be a good dramatization?
I actually think there couldn't. I think the interiority of Proust is so complex that I think that to dramatize it is to lead to turn it into costume drama is to lead to all those specious things about the snobbery and the belle époqueness, and you end up with sort of a Madame Verdurin salon. You end up with gossip, and you don't end up with that extraordinary sense of what it is to go to sleep and what it is to forget someone. I don't see how you can do it. I dread Proust on telly.
Do you know the Harold Pinter screenplay?
No. Oh, help. No.
Well, I mean, it's worth investigating.
Oh, thank you.
Anyway,
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm working at the moment on on a whole group of pots which are in conversation with the poems of Wallace Stevens. And I'm showing them next year in London in the autumn, next year in town, in a gallery. And perhaps we could continue that conversation with those groups of pots which come out of lyric poetry. Is that allowable?
Thank you to Edmund for such a wonderfully, not just eloquent, but I have to say creative reflection this evening on Proust and on pots and on so much in the space in between. It's been a joy to have him here. I hope that if anyone has not read The Hare with Amber Eyes, they will now be enthused and inspired to do so immediately, as of course will everyone who has not recently returned to Proust. We can not really have expected to have a better or warmer incitement to plunge back into that fantastic ocean again. So thank you for coming tonight, and above all, thank you to Edmund.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much, and thank you, Boyd.